It sounds to me like you're making... It sounds to me like you're making apologies for racism and fascism.
Of course I'm not. You idiot. Listen, I have told you there is vile things happening that differ.
Why are you bothered about...
Get him off. I don't want to listen. I do not want to speak to a man, frankly, who seems to have a pathological problem with the truth. Idiot. This is why we're not...
This exchange matters because it exposes the danger of collapsing every concern about immigration, integration, and social disorder into one convenient political label. The government may be right to condemn the thugs smashing windows, attacking police, and hijacking legitimate anger for violence. But that does not mean every voter worried about rapid demographic change, failed integration, or uncontrolled migration suddenly belongs in the same ideological category. And that is exactly the distinction this interview keeps trying to force into the open. Watch what happens when Alex asks a very basic question. What does far right actually mean in this context? Instead of getting a clear definition, the conversation immediately turns into accusation, defensiveness, and eventually outright insult. And that is the political problem. If ordinary concerns are dismissed instead of understood, you do not calm public anger. You deepen it. Before we roll the clip, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to Debate Central, and turn on notifications. Now let's get into it.
The reason I say I think the governments are frankly dangerous is because we have a situation that is clearly mushrooming out of control. It's not being quelled. And when Sir Keir Starmer turned around first time and said, far-right thugs, a load of people online, to me, demonstrably looked like quite ordinary people, started posting their photos and doing hashtag, I'm a far-right thug and so on and so forth. And as Tim and I were discussing earlier, when you talk about far-right as a political concept, they're normally people with matching shirts and a manifesto. When this started as people with ordinary concerns. Now, after the backlash against using that language, he then went on to do the same again. And to me, and I want your opinion on this, to me in doing so, what he did was further anger and alienate people who are using, a crisis in this country as an excuse to carry out the most awful violence and thuggery and behaviour that defiles our flag, frankly. These people need to be locked up. They're monstrous. But it also, I think, has excused really appalling behaviour on the other side, who now seem to be justified in righteous indignation. We're talking about Muslim communities, young men from those communities who feel disaffected, who are picking up in some instances weapons and forming mobs. So actually, far from making the situation go away and calming it down, I would suggest that he's thrown an accelerant onto the fire. Do you think he's handling this well?
I think he's handling it fine. I'm very, very, very confused by the concern in some quarters of the media, including yourself, about the terminology far right. Why do you have an issue with that being applied?
Well, okay, fine. Okay, let's do this actually. Let's do this. Tell me what is far right, and especially related to what is going on here. Explain far right. Give me the definition, please.
It's quite self-explanatory, but it's far to the right of the political axis.
No, well, explain it. You say it's self-explanatory. Yeah. That's tautological. That's like saying two twins. What is it? Explain it, list it, identify it, give it a shape, give it a texture so we all understand what you mean when you're using those words.
So it's a political ideology, obviously, and it's people whose political ideology, and like the far left, there'll be many different elements of it, and there's many different kind of variants of far left. There's people who will agree with each other and disagree with each other on the far right.
Do you think these people kicking in windows and acting like hooligans have a political ideology?
Some of them, of course they do. The EDL is a political organisation.
Some of them, Alex, you do see them making Hitler Nazi salutes. Some of them actually have swastikas tattooed onto their bodies.
I get that.
Yeah.
But when people were saying online, does this now make me far right as well?
Yes, it does, but Alex.
No.
The problem
when ordinary men and women were putting their pictures up on Twitter, who frankly just looked like, Bob and Jane next door, and people who served in the army and former police officers, and people of all colours and creeds saying, I am now a far right thug. Were they?
We need to address a bigger problem here, okay? And it makes people uncomfortable, and I'm sorry about that. But when people say, am I far right? Am I racist because I hold these views? Then if you do hold those views, then yes, you are.
Okay, what are these views? Where do we define this? Because when this began, right, there's definitely a hardened, vile core of people going out right now, mobile around the country, trashing our country, defiling our flag. That I agree with. But this started, actually, with a huge caucus of people concerned about uncontrolled immigration.
No,
is that a far right?
It didn't start with that, Alex. It didn't start with that. It started with lies and misinformation from people who seek division. You know, Andrew Tate.
This has got nothing to do with Andrew Tate. Andrew Tate did not suddenly get a lot of ordinary Brits upset about what is changing in their communities.
Because people, yes, he did, because people follow him online. He's the most searched man on the internet.
I worry that people like you have swallowed your own narrative to the extent that for some reason you cannot see the wood from the trees. You have spent so long gaslighting us that problems we see happening in our society don't exist and that they are our fault, and you're doing it again. You are repeating that language and that narrative. When are you going to go into listening mode and understand, actually, that discontent comes from something? It comes from, be it material need, it comes from a lack of integration and social concerns. When are you going to understand that? And instead of just
it sounds to me like you're making... It sounds to me like you're making apologies for racism and fascism.
Of course I'm not. You idiot. Listen, I've told you there is vile things happening that different...
Why are you bothered about...
Get him off. I don't want to listen. I do not want to speak to a man, frankly, who seems to have a pathological problem with the truth. Idiot.
And that right there is the deeper problem this exchange exposes. Not simply that two people lost their patience on television, but that Britain is struggling to have an adult political conversation about immigration, integration, public disorder, and social trust without immediately forcing everybody into ideological boxes. Start with the distinction that matters most. Violence is violence. Smashing property, threatening people, attacking police officers, or turning political anger into mob. Intimidation deserves condemnation, regardless of who is doing it. There is no conservative principle that requires making excuses for criminal disorder simply because some of the people involved claim to share concerns about immigration. If you break the law, you should face the consequences. But condemning violence does not require pretending that every underlying concern expressed by millions of ordinary people is illegitimate. That is where the political establishment repeatedly gets itself into trouble. The moment Alex asks what exactly qualifies somebody as far right, the discussion becomes revealing. If that term refers specifically to identifiable extremist beliefs, racist organizations, fascist ideology, or people advocating political violence, then say that clearly. Define the boundary and enforce it consistently. But if the category quietly expands until skepticism about immigration policy, concern about integration, frustration with government competence, or anxiety about changes within local communities can all be treated as evidence of extremism, then the label stops clarifying anything. It becomes a political weapon, and voters notice that. The most damaging thing a government can do during a period of genuine social tension is give peaceful citizens the impression that their concerns are being morally equated with the behavior of people smashing windows in the street. Those are not the same thing. One is political disagreement. The other can cross into criminality. That distinction matters because democracy depends upon giving people somewhere legitimate to take their grievances. If someone believes immigration is too high, answer the argument. If they believe integration has failed in particular communities, test that claim against the evidence. If they believe government policy has placed pressure on housing, services, policing, or community cohesion, politicians should explain what is true, what is exaggerated, and what they intend to do about it. Calling the person asking the question a racist does not answer any of those questions. And this is where the guest seriously weakened his own position. When Alex explicitly condemned the violence, and then tried to distinguish violent extremists from ordinary people with broader concerns, he responded by suggesting she sounded as though she was making excuses for racism and fascism. That accusation effectively ended the conversation, because once disagreement itself becomes evidence of moral guilt, debate becomes impossible. You are no longer persuading somebody. You are placing them outside the boundaries of acceptable opinion. For Republicans watching from America, there is a familiar political lesson here. Establishments often make their own populist opposition stronger when they refuse to distinguish between genuinely extreme behavior and mainstream dissatisfaction with government policy. You do not defeat political anger by mischaracterizing it. You feed it. And that does not mean every public grievance is automatically correct. Public opinion can be mistaken. Online misinformation can absolutely inflame an already tense situation. Political opportunists can exploit tragedy. Extremist organizations can attach themselves to legitimate issues precisely because they know those issues already carry emotional weight. A responsible government has to be capable of acknowledging all of those realities simultaneously. Condemn the extremists, prosecute criminal behavior, correct misinformation, but then confront the policy failures and public concerns that existed before the riot, before the viral posts, and before politicians started arguing over terminology. That is the part Westminster cannot afford to ignore, because trust collapses when people believe the political class is more interested in categorizing them than listening to them. And once that trust disappears, every government statement is interpreted through suspicion. Every label sounds like an insult. Every attempt at reassurance sounds like spin. That is an incredibly dangerous political environment, because responsible voices lose influence, while the angriest voices become more attractive. The final blow-up in this interview therefore matters less than the argument underneath it. Britain needs political leaders, and frankly, media figures as well, capable of drawing clear lines without erasing legitimate disagreement. There should be no ambiguity about political violence. There should also be no ambiguity about the right of ordinary citizens to question immigration, integration, policing, or government policy without automatically being treated as extremists. A confident democracy can do both. And if the establishment cannot understand that distinction, it should not be surprised when more and more voters conclude that the establishment simply is not listening.